Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 26 September 2025. Today I'm coming for you to you from Brno in the Czech Republic, but I'm not going to talk about Brno. Today's episode, however, could be seen as continuous with my previous episode on Dresden, in which I discussed the destruction and historic and subsequent reconstruction of Dresden. Although this happened in Brno as well, as I learned uh, in an earlier era than the destruction of Dresden. The cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul in Brno was largely destroyed by the Swedish siege of the city during the 30 Years' War. But at this time, today, I should say, I'm going to refer to a different war and its destructive consequences. 338 years ago today, on Friday, 26 September 1687, the Parthenon, which had managed to remain nearly intact through more than 2 millennia, was mostly destroyed in an engagement between the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Venice. We see the Parthenon and admire it today as a ruin, but that ruin was largely the result of the 1687 explosion. We tend to think of buildings being ruined as a result of a process of slow and incremental decay. And in some cases, this is how it happens. But the survival of a structure like the Pantheon in Rome, largely intact today, as it was seen in classical antiquity, demonstrates that a competently built structure can endure for 2,000 years or more. In a counterfactual history in which the 1687 explosion did not occur, the Parthenon today might be in a condition comparable to the Pantheon, more or less as it was known in classical antiquity. The Parthenon reached its completed form in 432 BC, when Athens was near its apogee of power and influence under Pericles. The giant statue of Athena Parthenos, that was the central cult image of the Parthenon, made of gold and ivory on a cypress wood frame, was originally dedicated in 438 BC. The statue was damaged by a fire at some point, still in classical times, and had to be rebuilt, but it remained in the Parthenon in its reconstructed form for thousands of years. It may have been removed by Christians in the 5th century during the lifetime of the philosopher Proclus, a Neoplatonist. As Proclus' biographer Marinus of Neapolis, in his Life of Proclus, mentions the incident, writing, quote, "How much Proclus was loved by the philosophic goddess is abundantly evinced by his philosophic life, which he chose through her persuasions, and that with the great success we have hitherto described. But she clearly demonstrated her affection for Proclus by the following circumstance. When her image, which had been so long dedicated in the Parthenon or temple, was taken away by those who, without any hesitation, moved out of their places things most holy, and which ought to be immovable, there appeared to the philosopher in a dream a woman of a graceful form, who admonished him to build a temple with great expedition, for, says she, it pleases Minerva, the presiding deity of philosophy, to dwell with you." Unquote. So if the Athena Parthenos was removed from the Parthenon during the life of Proclus, that narrows the range of dates to between AD 412 and AD 485, but none of this is known for certain. There's speculation that the statue was taken to Constantinople, but no one today knows what happens to it. I say no one today knows what happened to it, but it was removed from the Parthenon by human hands, so there were once a number of individuals who knew the exact fate of the Athena Parthenos, at least at that moment when it passed through their hands. Last night I was reading Peter Strawson's Skepticism and Naturalism, Some Varieties, and in this Strawson wrote, quote, "We are equally happy to acknowledge with the poet that full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and with the naturalist metaphysician, that many a historical fact is destined to remain unverified and unverifiable by subsequent generations. Unquote. The poet to whom Strawson referred was Thomas Gray, and the poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, which includes these lines. Full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness on the desert air. What Gray had postulated of unobserved beauty, Strawson extrapolated to once known but subsequently lost historical facts. And so it was with the Athena Parthenos. The fate of the statue is destined to remain unverified and unverifiable by subsequent generations. But once the cult statue and the furnishings of antiquity were gone, the outward structure of the Parthenon remained intact. Those who had the good fortune to see the Parthenon prior to 1687 saw it, at least the exterior of the building, much as it was in antiquity. This was more than a century before Lord Elgin carted away much of the sculptural decoration between 1801 and 1812. That's a whole other story for another time, and a problem that remains unresolved in our time, since Elgin took the marbles under questionable circumstances, and Greece has formally petitioned for the return of the Elgin marbles. I personally find it quite interesting that, despite the current craze among curators to give away their collections, as when the Smithsonian Institution repatriated a number of Benin bronzes to Nigeria, this trend hasn't yet caused the British Museum to give up the Elgin marbles. Germany repatriated more than 1,000 bronzes to Nigeria, but the Elgin marbles stay put. In any case, the Parthenon had suffered from neglect and damage over more than 2,000 years, but remained largely intact until some 2,119 years after its completion. It was largely destroyed by the explosion of a Turkish ammunition store kept in the Parthenon, which was ignited by a Venetian mortar round. An account of the destruction of the Parthenon by the German officer Major Sobiewolski, quoted in a 1941 paper by T.E. Mommsen, runs as follows, quote, there came a deserter from the castle with the news that the commander of the fortress had all the stores of powder and other precious things brought to the temple, which is called the Temple of Minerva, and that also the people of rank were there because they believed that the Christians would not do any harm to the temple. Upon this report, several mortars were directed against the temple, but none of the bombs was able to do damage, particularly because the upper roof of the temple was somewhat sloping and covered with marble and thus well protected. A lieutenant from Luneburg, however, offered to throw bombs into the temple, and this was done, for one of the bombs fell through the temple and right into the Turkish store of powder, whereupon the middle of the temple blew up, and everything inside was covered with stone, to the great consternation of the Turks. Unquote. So, even more than the roof, which at the time was over 2,000 years old, was able to shed most of the bombs that were dropped on it. And it wasn't until the Luneburg lieutenant managed to get a mortar through a hole in the roof that the structure was destroyed by the resulting explosion. An anonymous German officer quoted in the same paper wrote, quote, early in the morning, the cannon and bomb throwing began again, but many of these were misthrown. Towards evening, one fell into the beautiful temple of the goddess Minerva in such a way that the beautiful building was completely ruined by the mighty blow. Unquote. From these two quotes, it's obvious that those present at the siege of the Acropolis recognized the historical and aesthetic importance of the Parthenon. The Turks thought that the Christians wouldn't attack the building, and the German officer explicitly described the building as beautiful. Therefore, we can't say that those fighting at the siege of the Acropolis were oblivious to the value of the Parthenon. They knew it had value, except perhaps for the Luneburg lieutenant who offered to throw bombs into the middle of it, and the Venetians on whose behalf the siege was being prosecuted, and still they persisted in their bombardment. There are many instances in war when soldiers are ordered to destroy things of value, as I just talked about in my episode on Dresden in the Augustan age. To refuse an order is to be subject to courts martial, or in the heat of combat, possibly something worse. There's an ancient Roman saying that the laws are silent in time of war. And anyway, it might be perfectly lawful under the laws of war to destroy historical artifacts. There are a couple passages in Voltaire's Candide in which Voltaire skewers the idea of the laws of war. For example, quote, Candide resolved to go and reason elsewhere on causes and effects. He passed over heaps of dead and dying. The first reached in a neighboring village. It was in cinders. It was an Abare village which the Bulgarians had burnt according to the laws of war. Here, old men covered with wounds beheld their wives hugging their children to their bloody breasts, massacred before their faces. There, their daughters disemboweled and breathing their last, having satisfied the natural wants of the Bulgarian heroes, while others, half burnt in the flames, begged to be dispatched. The earth was strewn with brains, arms, and legs. Unquote. We are often reminded by well-meaning civil libertarians that soldiers have a duty to refuse the unlawful orders of superiors, but such a refusal is rare. And we hear people say with a certain derision in their voice, he was only following orders, as though the speaker himself would have had the courage in like circumstances to refuse an order. Of course, many soldiers follow orders despite their misgivings. A famous example of this is the air bombardment of the Abbey of Monte Cassino during the Second World War. There was disagreement among the commanders at the time as to whether the abbey should be bombed or not, but the decision ultimately made was ultimately made to carry out the raid. I watched at least one World War II documentary that included interviews with Catholic airmen who participated in the bombing of Monte Cassino, and they followed their orders despite their personal misgivings. And while the decision to bomb Monte Cassino has been questioned and criticized since then, no one says that it was a war crime, although it may have been unnecessary and perhaps even counterproductive. So the historical, artistic, or religious value of the Abbey of Monte Cassino didn't play much of a role in the decision to bomb the site, at least not enough of a role to prevent the action. It seems that the one way to understand the siege of the Acropolis, with soldiers who I said before were not oblivious of its value, and the destruction of the Parthenon is to see it as an early modern parallel to what happened with the Abbey of Monte Cassino. Wars are one of the great constants of civilization, and wars have a certain consistency through history. And the destruction of the Parthenon wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of an operation that was part of a war. The explosion that tore apart the Parthenon on 26 September 1687 was only one event in the siege of the Acropolis, which took place from 23rd to the 29th of September. And the siege of the Acropolis was only one episode in a war between the Ottoman Turks and the Venetians. This war between the Ottoman Turks and the Venetians was the Great Turkish War from 14 July 1683 to 26 January 1699. We can further contextualize the Great Turkish War by the conflict between Christendom and Islam, which continues to the present day, alternating between hot wars like the Great Turkish War and periods of détente. The conflict between Christendom and Islam has been a feature of history in the Old World since Islam rose to political and military significance not long after its origins. But this long delay conflict between Christianity and Islam has endured for 1,000 years fewer than the role of the Parthenon and the Acropolis in Western history. The Parthenon itself, after ceasing to be a pagan sanctuary, was for a time a Christian church under the Byzantine Empire, and then a mosque while Greece was occupied by the Ottoman Empire. So, in its long history, it has been on both sides of this long delay conflict between Christianity and Islam. And even after the explosion of the Parthenon, a mosque was built into the structure of the Parthenon and was later removed when modern restoration efforts began. One can't overstate the importance of the Parthenon and the Acropolis to Western art, and even to the conception of the beautiful itself in Western thought, which is so central to our civilization. Many Westerners make an aesthetic pilgrimage to the Parthenon, and I myself visited the Parthenon, and even in its ruined state, my visit to the site was one of the peak experiences in my life. I had arrived early in Athens on a ferry that got in about 6 a.m. From an overnight ferry from Crete in 1993. And after dropping off my bags at a luggage storage place, I went straight away to the Acropolis, and I was only the third person to enter on that day. And I had almost the entire place to myself for sunrise. And that's a morning I'll never forget, but that's a story for another time. By the time I left the Acropolis a few hours later, the crowds were so thick I had to elbow my ways to the exit. And I remember that as clearly as I remember seeing sunrise on the Acropolis. One more thing for today. The 26th of September is also, in addition to being the anniversary of the destruction of the Parthenon, was also the birthday of Martin Heidegger. And if I knew Heidegger's work better, I would produce an episode on him, but I find Heidegger almost impossible to read. I've touched on Heidegger in several episodes, most especially those on Hannah Arendt, J. Glenn Gray, and my addendum on Gray and thinking. Both Arendt and Gray were profoundly influenced by Heidegger, so it's pretty much impossible to talk about them without talking about Heidegger's influence. Strawson actually quoted Heidegger in the book I mentioned earlier, and I concur with Strawson's agreement with Heidegger on the point at issue. So this may be a way for me into Heidegger's thought. So maybe someday I will buckle down and force myself to read enough Heidegger that I can give an account of his conception of historicity, which has been quite influential, but that will have to wait for the time being. So thanks for listening.